John Aloysius Landy, my dad, and the man who's known me the longest in my lifetime. He was there for me on the day I was born. Dad was the youngest of 5 children, and with his passing he now joins his whole family in heaven. Dad's father was Francis, a bank manager. After they spent his baby years in Cairns, in far north Queensland, the family was posted to Swan Hill in Victoria in 1929. I think he spent 6 or 7 years there before his father was then posted to Northcote in Melbourne. On many occasions, Dad told us stories of his Swan Hill memories. It was time of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. He remembered so many people out of work and the kindness his family showed to others when they too were doing it tough. He also witnessed the rabbit and mice plagues and how people battled on during these very, very tough years, making the ties of family so much stronger than we may see today. I recall most fondly the snake story which Dad often repeated to all of us. Dad used to refuse to wear shoes until one day, as he was walking, he heard a strange sound and stopped dead in his tracks. Looking down, he saw a large brown snake slithering just in front of his toes. He jumped and avoided it and ran home, later telling me that this was the actual day the 4-minute mile was broken by John Landy. Dad's saddest memory of his childhood was the death of his brother Frank. This was caused by an ear injury at school. Frank had taught Dad his prayers and made sure he said them every night on his knees. He never stopped saying them or remembering his brother. Another tale he used to recount was the capture of his brother Pat during World War II by the Germans following the raid on St. Nazaire. Pat returned after 3 years in a German prisoner of war camp. During World War II, Dad joined the Royal Australian Air Force, and thankfully for us, he had a less eventful time than his brother Pat. He mainly did nighttime sentry duty. When the war finished, Dad was able to return to and complete his accountancy studies. He was so proud of finishing the degree as shown on his graduation photo on the front of today's program. Dad would have been a certified practicing accountant for 69 years this July. In the 1950s, Dad met our mother, Maureen Ayres, through his parish church in Sandringham. From the first moment he saw her and laid eyes on her, he was smitten, and remained so during their 60 years of marriage. He died the day before they were to celebrate their 61st wedding anniversary. Mum was a pianist and played recitals on the ABC radio and television in Victoria, and I have such fond memories early in my life of Dad playing the piano and the violin. I also remember Mum and Dad playing music together. Those were brilliant evenings which encouraged me, Peter and Annie to try and emulate them on the piano, Peter more successfully than Annie and I. Mum and Dad were married in June of '56. 3 children, Michael, Peter and Anne-Marie, were born in 1957 through to 1959. In the early 1962, Dad's job in the Tariff Board relocated to Canberra, and we moved into a brand new house later that year. 7 more children from 1963 to 1972 followed. Francis, Danielle, Claire, John, Bernadette, Marie-Therese and Rosemary, most of whom are with us here today to celebrate Dad's life. Mum and Dad enjoyed living in Red Hill until September of 2015. 53 years in one house is a pretty good innings. I remember St. Bede's Red Hill was our parish church, where the Canberra children were baptised, and all the children, including myself, Peter and Annie, did our first communion and our confirmations. Dad and Mum were very proud of us. They taught us the rosary, and we said it as a family at least once every day. Whenever I went on road trips with Dad, we would say it many times together. In the last 10 years, Dad also was saying St. Faustina's Chaplet of the Divine Mercy, as well as attending Mass every day. I hope us praying the chaplet gave him some comfort on his last days. My recollections of the early 60s was Dad's wood workshop. This was also Dad's hobby room and storage area for a vast amount of wood. Dad hoarded every scrap of timber, saying, "That piece will come in handy one day." There was still plenty waiting to be used when we sold the house. Annie, Danielle, Marie-Therese and I spent many days sorting through it before the house was sold. I remember when we were very young, Peter and I found a tiny gap in the door to Dad's hobby room, and we could only look with one eye, so we took turns. We could see him making something. They looked like billy carts, one green and one blue. This must have been in late 1964, as Santa Claus became a legend to us when we both got a billy cart that Christmas Day. Despite almost daily robust use by us, those billy carts were so soundly made that they were eventually resurrected for Dad's grandchildren, of which Alex and Stuart were the first to take them to on the slopes of Red Hill. In 1965, on my 8th birthday, Dad presented me with a train set, which he said he had bought for me, but I was never convinced it wasn't for him too. We had such fun with that train and the track, which took up one whole garage space, and by the Dad had finished with extending it. Dad was a very giving person. Whilst I was one of a large family, he always made each of us feel very special. He also loved his annual visits to Malakuta in Victoria to catch up with his brother Kevin and school friend Maury. This was pretty well the only thing he ever did which he didn't share with any of us, but we enjoyed a good feed of flathead on his return. In 1970, Dad took me to Sydney by train, where we attended a mass celebrated by Pope Paul VI in front of 200,000 people. Dad's workplace name changed in 1972 to the Industries Assistance Commission, but his work ethics remained the same, and I remember him working hard, writing reports well past midnight, day after day. He was promoted to Assistant Commissioner for the Industries Assistance Commission in the late 70s. In November of 75, we watched when the dismissal unfolded when Gough Whitlam was sacked by Governor-General Sir John Kerr. Dad said to me, "Remember this day as a big historical event, Michael. This doesn't happen all the time." In 1986, Dad had his first and only overseas trip, visiting many countries, including France and England. He retired from the public service in 1988, giving him nearly 28 years of free time to enjoy his children and grandchildren and to help Father Parsons publish Iota Unum. Once he retired, whenever I could, I took Dad on work trips with me, including to Cairns, his birthplace, and we got as far as Cape York Peninsula on that one. We saw each other every 6 to 8 weeks over the last decade on my visits to Canberra. I got to whisper to him last week that I too was retiring after 42 years in my industry. A couple of months ago I asked Dad what his favourite things were, and he replied, Mum and his children, his great-grandchildren, and his first great-grandchild, Elijah. Dad, you are now with your son Francis and Elijah, all your brothers and sisters, and your mum and dad. Rest soundly in their warm embrace. Thank you for always bringing a warm smile to our hearts. May you continue to smile from us above and guide us for our daily lives. Thank you.